Okay, welcome everyone to the May Project Trust webinar. Today we will be discussing trauma-informed crisis response and safety planning. Project Trust is a national program focused on providing training and technical assistance to the human trafficking field through the Office of Victims of Crime. This program aims to support organizations across the country as they work to integrate a trauma-informed approach to each level of service delivery and the overall organizational structure. Project Trust is a collaboration between the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI, the Sinar Institute, and the Brandeis University's Institute on Assets and Social Policy. Today, we're aiming to provide an overview of trauma-informed crisis response best practices when assisting individuals in active emergency human trafficking situations. We'll also be highlighting and sharing practical steps to safety planning with individuals working directly with stakeholders. And lastly, we'll explore best practices through practical case application. Just a few reminders before we get started on the content. When we hold these webinars, we really like to take a moment and remind everyone that our goals are to maintain a safe space by allowing our colleagues to voice thoughts, questions, and concerns through the chat feature. We want to identify and help draw out the strengths that each individual brings to this training through the chat feature and always communicate with respect. And lastly, we want to just remind everyone to participate in the discussion with an open mind and allow people to pick up new skills and make great connections through this webinar. And is there anything else that anyone would like to remind us about when joining this webinar and creating a safe space? I'll pause. Okay, and the goal of this webinar is to make it as useful and impactful as possible. So I encourage everyone to join in on the conversation. And as we move through these topics, please feel free to use the chat and Q&A features to ask questions, share insight, and connect with your colleagues. And so as I move through this information, Kate Keisel will be answering questions in the Q&A and in the chat. My name is Naja Martin, and I am here as a member of Project Trust. My role within Project Trust focuses on providing comprehensive training and technical assistance to organizations striving to implement a trauma-informed lens to every level of their work with individuals who have lived experience in the trafficking field. At Sinar, I am the Thrive Initiative's Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator, where I provide high-level assistance to organizations both domestically and internationally. Previously, I've worked for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, working directly with individuals in crisis. There, I became the hotline's training manager, where I developed comprehensive crisis response tools to help frontline stakeholders. Now I'd love to learn a little bit about you. So I'm going to launch a poll in a moment. So please take a moment to tell us what best describes your work. I'll go ahead and wrap this poll up at the 1 minute and 5 second mark to allow everyone to participate. Thank you to everyone who provided that feedback. This will definitely help us as we continue to create new content for this audience. So before we jump into the content, I just wanted to provide a couple of self-care reminders as we move through this training and this webinar. If you need to, feel free to step out for a moment and grab something to drink to stay hydrated. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available at a later time. Also recognize that there may be some feelings that come up during this training, and you may need some time afterwards to debrief and process all of this critical information. And finally, all of this information is very heavy. So I always urge individuals to be kind to yourselves and practice patience as you seek to implement the suggestions following the webinar. So now we're going to move into the fundamentals of a trauma-informed crisis response. What is a trauma-informed crisis response? Trauma-informed crisis response incorporates trauma-informed and person-centered principles by being trauma responsive, provide culturally relevant supports, and is grounded in ethics and comes from a place of empowerment when supporting individuals seeking assistance. It includes a thorough assessment of all aspects of safety. This includes physical safety, communication safety, location or environmental safety, and finally, emotional safety. In a trauma-informed crisis response, the stakeholder practices de-escalation in order to introduce trauma response mitigation and management tools. The stakeholder loops in the appropriate services and incorporates the individual into all service provision steps and choices. And finally, a trauma-informed crisis response safety plans with, not for, an individual to plan for safety, for future safety, regardless of if the individual is planning to leave their situation or not. A trauma-informed and person-centered approach is grounded in several areas that were touched upon on the last slide. However, in practice, what does a trauma-informed and person-centered approach look like? By trauma responsive, we mean that the stakeholder actively engages the individual based on their understanding of the neurobiology of trauma and its impact on the individual's trauma responses. This means that the stakeholder actively integrates tools and skills that support the individual and also practices patience. Next, the stakeholder actively incorporates culturally relevant supports where appropriate. It's integral to crisis response that stakeholders from similar backgrounds as the individuals being assisted are available and are versed in trauma responsiveness. Stakeholders from similar cultural backgrounds can speak to the individual in their language, understand any cultural nuances to their unique situation, and can safety plan with cultural relevance. This approach is also grounded in ethical codes, such as the NSAW Code of Ethics. And lastly, this approach is based in the empowerment of the individual. So this means that the stakeholder is encouraging autonomy and actively is incorporating the individual in the choice of crisis services and explicitly incorporates them into how the individual manages the nuances of their situation or how they choose to include the stakeholder in their choices. Individuals who have been impacted by human trafficking lose their autonomy as an integral piece of human trafficking. So as stakeholders who are aware of the limitations in choice, we should always be deferring back to empowering language and incorporating choice into every single aspect of service delivery that we can. For additional information on trauma-informed and person-centered approaches, please refer to the Project Trust December webinar, which is currently linked on the Project Trust website. The first step of any crisis response should be to assess the safety of the individual seeking assistance. This means that the stakeholders are actively seeking to understand if there is any potential for harm while we are engaging with that individual. And so a full safety assessment should really be assessing physical safety, environmental or location safety, communication safety, and emotional safety. And so by physical safety, we mean that the stakeholder addresses the potential for injuries. And if there are any injuries, making sure that we're assessing for the extent of those potential injuries on the individual's well-being and overall health. When we assess for physical safety, if there is a concern about an injury, we should inquire if the injury is life-threatening or if the individual can care for that injury without involving emergency services. Remember, these individuals know their situation best and they have been in that situation and have taken care of themselves. So always defer back to how they would like to go about caring for their physical safety. Following an assessment of physical safety, stakeholders should address the safety of the location and the environment which the individual is currently in. This means asking if there's anyone around who could potentially harm them, and if they are somewhere where they can safely talk to you without interruption. If the individual is seeking emergency extraction services, this is where the stakeholders should be asking for descriptions of the location, addresses, landmarks, and any other specific location details that's going to assist in developing a plan for extraction next steps. Following the confirmation that the individual is both physically safe and the location is not posing any threats to their well-being, the stakeholders should assess the safety of the method of communication. This is extremely important. In this step, stakeholders should inquire about what should be done if the call is disrupted by someone who could do harm, if it is safe to call back, and if there are any safe words that you want to use and what those safe words mean. For example, if it becomes unsafe or if there's violence, how would the individual like the stakeholder to respond? Do they want immediate law enforcement or medical services response? Or would they like you to wait for them to call back at a future time after you've disconnected? And lastly, the individuals who might be experiencing a trauma response, if they are experiencing that response, the stakeholder should provide support to manage those responses and ground the individual in the moment. This can be done by taking a few deep breaths together, grounding them in the five senses, or doing some other self-soothing practices, which I'll highlight next. So de-escalating trauma responses, we've talked about this in previous webinars, but in crisis response, this can look slightly different. So de-escalation of trauma responses will apply from the beginning until the very end of a crisis response, as we know that trauma responses can really occur at any given time during your interaction. Best practices in mitigating and managing these responses always defer back to that trauma-informed approach to engagement. This means that stakeholders remain person-centered by asking for and using preferred pronouns and always choosing to honor the wishes and needs of the individual who are seeking our help. Always referring back to the individual and what feels good for them allows them to exercise some control and get in touch with their own needs and actively participate in the crisis response planning process. Active listening is a best practice in crisis response because stakeholders need to be able to understand the dynamics at play for each unique trafficking situation. We may know what trafficking looks like from a federally defined level, but each individual trafficking situation is going to have its own unique challenges that we need to be able to understand. So active listening and participating with nonverbal and verbal cues highlights that the stakeholder is taking in all of this crucial information and letting the individual know that they are important and they are telling us very important things and that we appreciate that they're telling us this. We are also demonstrating in active listening that the stakeholder is an active participant in this conversation and wants to support the individual in whatever way feels good for them. It highlights the practice of not just expressing verbal and nonverbal cues, but it also incorporates asking clarifying questions when there is a misunderstanding. By asking clarifying questions in the moment, stakeholders demonstrate that what the individual is telling them is important and valuable. Safe communication best practices are applicable to each conversation that we have with the individual who is impacted by human trafficking. However, in a crisis situation, it is even more important to use non-threatening and non-judgmental language, as we want to allow as much space as possible for the individual to feel safe disclosing sensitive information to us and feel like we are a safe place to turn to if they need help. And by practicing non judgmental and non threatening verbal cues, this highlights that we are not there to judge them or to be another person that might not believe them. Safe communication also incorporates best practices such as modeling positive behaviors, such as active listening, mirroring the language the individual uses to refer to themselves and their situation, and expressing compassion for the individual by thanking them for sharing. Lastly, relaxation and grounding techniques will be crucial to include in our arsenal when responding to a crisis situation. Please refer back to those previous Project Trust webinars for further examples of relaxation and grounding techniques that will be useful in these types of situations. After safety is assessed and trauma responses of the individual have been de-escalated, stakeholders should shift gears to identifying the most appropriate services for the individual based on what they have expressed as their needs. There are varying resources depending on where you are in the country. However, there are national resources that we can all tap into. And some of these resources include the OVC funded Human Trafficking Services and Task Forces map, which you can find on the OVC website. This particular resource can pinpoint the exact organizations and task forces in your area that provide human trafficking services that are funded by the federal government. There's also the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which has an extensive referral database that stretches the entire country and can be refined to crisis services for particular demographics or for particular needs. It's also helpful to explore trauma-informed community services that are demographically and culturally relevant to the population in your area. If you do not already have an understanding of those services that are going to be helpful in your area, it is really best practice for stakeholders to build on existing partnerships or create partnerships in your community so you can triage these crisis situations together. And so when we are working with other individuals or other stakeholders, it'll help all of the individuals who are reaching out to us for immediate assistance, because then we can very clearly and procedurally reach out to 24/7 crisis call centers, crisis response teams that are actively out in the community and working with individuals in an outreach capacity as well as in the crisis response capacity. And we can also highlight the different types of services that are available 24/7 without having to engage law enforcement or any other sort of emergency legal or law response. This is very important to clarify with the stakeholder before offering their services to individuals in active crises, because we don't want to incorporate stakeholders who might have to take or who might take certain actions that the survivor or the individual with lived experience seems or deems as unsafe for them. So we want to always make sure what the various service providers must do before looping them into any crisis situation. And when we're thinking of the involvement of law enforcement or emergency services, it's incredibly important to practice informed consent with these individuals in crisis. That is, if you're a stakeholder who is a mandated reporter or have any other reporting obligations, be upfront and be very clear and let the individual know about these things before they disclose any potential information that may trigger those protocols. This allows the individual to practice autonomy and choose whether or not they would like to engage with this sort of service at all. Safety planning is the final step of any trauma-informed crisis response. Safety planning is an actionable plan aimed at reducing harm or risk in an unsafe situation. A complete safety plan incorporates planning for current and future physical, communication-based, and location or environmental risks. Safety planning should also actively seek to include action steps for individuals to manage their own trauma responses. Before moving on to safety planning, we want to do a couple of things and be mindful of a couple of things. First, we want to consistently check in to make sure that it is continually safe to engage in conversations with the individual who is reaching out for help. So we want to confirm those safety details, asking questions like, are you still okay to talk? I know we've been on the phone for 20 plus minutes. Do you need to go? Do you need to call me back at all? And making sure that they're aware of the quick exit steps should the situation become unsafe. And so if you are engaging with someone over a chat feature, making sure that there is a quick exit button on your website. Or if you are engaging via texting, making sure that you're setting up those safe words. Next, you want to avoid recreating the wheel. So there are lots of services out there, and we want to make sure that we're not resending an individual to any services that they have already explored and maybe exhausted, or we want to highlight any services that they have used before and are finding to be supportive. So if they are already using a service that they have found to be very supportive and helpful for them in the past, we want to make sure that we're looping in those services and making sure that that is still something that they want. And lastly, we want to follow the individual's lead. This means that the individual has survived this long in their situation and they know how to maintain their safety, even when we think that something is unsafe. Remember, safety means something different to everyone, and this is particularly true for individuals who are in trafficking situations or who have experienced any sort of complex trauma. And we want to support their decisions as best as we can. So now let's go ahead and move towards a deeper dive into safety planning with individuals who are in active human trafficking crises, now that we understand the fundamentals and best practices for that trauma-informed response. A complete safety plan includes all of these things that are listed here, and it includes a plan that addresses what an individual will do for current and future safety needs. Just as the safety assessment that a stakeholder would do at the beginning of a crisis response, the stakeholder should aim to create a plan for all of these ongoing needs. So first, we want to plan for physical safety. So after you've done your assessment and are sure that they are physically safe to talk to you, we want to create a plan for continued well-being of an individual who is currently seeking crisis response services. So a plan for physical safety should include a plan for current and future injuries. If the injuries are life-threatening, does the individual know how to get in touch with emergency medical services? And this might mean talking through a phone call to 911 or getting in touch with a clinic in the community that offers emergency services. And if there is anything preventing them from accessing those services, what is that? What is that? What is the barrier? How can we plan to get around this barrier? And how will the stakeholder be included if they need to be included into circumventing these obstacles? If injuries are not life-threatening, how will they care for themselves? And what role, if any, will the stakeholder take in supporting them? A plan should also include how they will access medications that they need. If the individual intends to leave their situation, will they have access to medications such as gender-confirming medicines or any life-sustaining medications? What would happen or what could happen if they don't have access to those medications? Is there another stakeholder that can be brought into this process to provide access to medications at safe and accessible locations? And lastly, If the individual does not have access to basic life-sustaining necessities, how will the stakeholder and the individual plan for that? Are there food pantries or other food and nutrition services that they can easily access? Next, what is the plan for communication safety for now and into the future for all other points of interaction? Importantly, what is the plan for physical interruption of the conversation by a trafficker or others? What should the stakeholder do if the trafficker gets on the phone? And this conversation should specifically look like, how should the stakeholder identify before disconnecting? For example, should the stakeholder identify as someone who's calling from a phone company or a telemarketer, where you can easily disconnect without having to provide any additional information or answer any questions from a trafficker? And if there is active violence occurring on the other end of the line, what would the individual like the stakeholder to do? We also want to note here that in the event of violence, the stakeholder should not automatically default to law enforcement or for emergency services unless explicitly directed to do so by the individual during safety planning. So, and the reason why I bring this up is that if law enforcement arrives to their location without them having actually called or being aware that that law enforcement has been dispatched, it may create a more unsafe situation and may result in the individual refusing to reach out again. Permissions are also extremely useful when developing a plan for communication. Before doing so, stakeholders should always confirm if they can leave a message with identifying information and if they can send text or reach out first without the individual prompting a conversation. It's also crucial to understand who has access to the devices the individual is using to reach out for help. If the individual uses a cell phone, who else has access to and potentially uses that cell phone? Are there certain times that are unsafe to communicate, or are there times that are preferable for the individual who can actually be able to safely talk at different times? Safe words can also be used by the individual to inform the stakeholder of any safety concerns. And this is really important to set up, especially if the trafficking situation is violent or has any physical abuse indicators. Best practice is to highlight two words. One would mean it is safe to talk, and one would mean that they would like emergency assistance, such as law enforcement. You always want to clarify what the individual believes or understands is emergency assistance. You don't want to misunderstand and call, emergency services like 911 when the individual prefers you to go about it in a different way. Next, essential phone numbers should be stored safely. If the individual does not have sole custody of their communication devices, contacts or stakeholders, emergency supports, and friends or family their contact information should be stored in another place other than the device itself. And instead of storing the actual names of the contacts in the device, they should be stored as something nondescript that won't cause alarm to the trafficker. This is incredibly important if the trafficker is checking a phone or checking devices that the individual regularly uses. Lastly, if the individual is seeking immediate help, leaving their situation, the stakeholder should be assessing and planning for battery life for their devices to ensure that they can maintain contact with the stakeholder. Additionally, stakeholders should remind the individuals to remember their chargers and anything else that will ensure continued contact. Next, we are going to move on to environmental or location safety. First, when we are creating a plan for this, we need to plan for potential harm. We don't understand all of the nuances that go into what makes a place safe or not for an individual. So we want to make sure that we are including them in the plan for any additional harm that can come from being in the location that they're in. And this could be discussing any additional perpetrator or trafficker who could be around and who could be monitoring them. We also want to highlight any privacy concerns that we should be aware of when we are interacting with the individual. This is especially true for when there are concerns around expression of gender identity in the individual's location. If gender identity is being used as a means of potentially outing the individual to folks who don't know about their gender identity. We want to make sure that we are aware of what that conversation or what that environment looks like, and make sure that we're using the preferred gender pronouns that is safe in that particular environment. We also want to highlight safe spaces in safety planning for a location. We want to highlight if there are any zones in the home or the location where the individual can safely get away from any potential abusers. And this could look like, for example, staying away from the kitchen because there could be weapons and it could be unsafe, and it could potentially be closed in without any exit route. A safe place could be for an individual a room with windows and two exits, so that they are visible from the street in case there is any violence or anything like that. And you want to loop in the individual in identifying these safe spaces. These are just examples of potential safe spaces, but this could look very different for each individual. Next, we want to discuss relocation. We know that with trafficking, that folks can or cannot or may not be moved to different locations depending on their situation. So when we are thinking through potential changes in location, we want to really think about where are they going? When will they be moved, and when will they arrive? And are there any additional safety concerns in this new place? And has this individual gone there before? And are they able to continue conversing with us and contacting us from this new location? And lastly, we want to be aware of any exposure to unsafe materials. And so if the individual is working someplace, such as in fields or in cleaning services, are they exposed to any harmful chemicals? And if so, is there any impact on their health? And how can we plan for addressing these sorts of safety concerns? Next, we want to highlight resources and next steps. So we want to highlight things like who to call for immediate needs. If your services at your organization do not offer crisis or 24/7 services, highlight some other local services and stakeholders who are able to respond to and meet the need of the individual. And we also want to integrate the individual's wishes into whatever happens next. What would they like to happen next if they have left their situation? Do they want continued support from the stakeholder? Do they want to get into emergency shelter? Do they want to go and live with other family members? Anything like that, we want to make sure that we're planning for whatever those next steps are, so that once the individual who potentially leaves their situation aren't just sitting on the street in potentially unsafe circumstances. And lastly, we want to create a follow-up plan. I want to remind everyone that not every individual is going to want or need a follow-up plan, and your services might be a one-off approach or one-off solution. But if they do want additional services and do want additional contact from you, if so, who's going to reach out first? Do you expect them to reach out to you for continued services, or are they expecting for you to meet them somewhere or reach out to them? And how should the individual contact stakeholders? Should they be going into a walk-in center? Should they be reaching out via a phone? And are they reaching out to a specific individual? And what should the individual expect moving forward after they have left the crisis response services? Are they going to be moving towards a transitional housing situation, or are they going to be moving into another program that you or another stakeholder is offering? What should they be expecting, and what things should they be bringing with them to access those services? And lastly, What should the stakeholder expect? Should the stakeholder be expecting that they will potentially have service animals? Do they have children? How are we planning for all of these different nuances that might be very unique to their situation? And so, what other safety planning do we need to think about in light of the impact of COVID-19? So, we know that there is an impact on how survivors and individuals with lived experience in human trafficking can access safe programs because of the impact of COVID-19. So, what can we do if they have to remain in the home? The first option is a buddy system. So they should identify someone that they trust and who supports them and who might be aware of what's going on in their situation. This buddy system looks like reaching out to their trusted individual and just sending a code word to confirm that they are safe, or establishing a code word for when they're unsafe and they want to let someone know what's going on if that person is not the stakeholder themselves. We should also be planning for in-home events of violence or potential disruption of conversations and things like that. So when we are thinking of children who may be involved in a trafficking situation or may be exposed to potential abuse in the home, we want to make sure that there is a safety plan created for what the child should do if there is violence that is occurring in the home. So will they be hiding somewhere? That is deemed safe? Will they be going to a neighbor's home? What will happen so that the child remains safe? We also want to highlight emergency contacts for the child, talking through the difference between 911 and calling a relative who might be trusted. We want to discuss code words with children and what they mean and what actions to take following the code word. And lastly, we want to highlight an exit plan. If the child is in the home when there is some form of abuse occurring or some safety concern occurring, we want to highlight when they should leave and who they should be going to. And lastly, we know that we are engaging with survivors and individuals with lived experience much more over digital means rather than in person. So if someone is concerned about their safety because they are using digital platforms, we want to make sure that we are talking them through how to clear their caches, how to clear history, and how to clear chat logs. This also is going to be important in highlighting quick exits. So for many of us who have a virtual platform to engage with individuals in crises or who are looking for services, a lot of times we have a quick exit button that reroutes to a different website that would be safe in the event that someone else sees what website that they're on. We also want to highlight any alternative email addresses or usernames and accounts that are safe for the individual to use if their primary accounts are being monitored. So lastly, with safety planning, we want a safety plan for continued trauma responses. This means that we are creating emergency wellness plans with the individual. And so we can create a plan that promotes safety within the body when the individual is experiencing trauma responses. For additional information on trauma responses and mitigating those responses, you can refer back to previous webinars on those trauma responses and the materials provided. But some of the things that we could do in the moment or highlight for the individuals to do in the moment include deep belly breathing, a quick meditation, or a quick body scan to calm the nerves and really understand what's going on within the body, positive self-talk, self-soothing, and any sensory-based supports that they can access easily and without much alerting to anyone else of their needs, especially if that environment is unsafe. We also want to help them highlight or identify their support network. Who can they reach out to when they are experiencing a trauma response and they are not in physical danger from someone else? This is just an example of a plan that a stakeholder can highlight for individuals to manage their trauma responses. This plan highlights relaxation skills that they have tried and work for them. This can be supported by the stakeholder by doing these exercises with them when they are not experiencing any immediate threats to their safety. And we can also highlight their support network and who they deem as safe and appropriate to turn to when they experience their trauma responses. This can include the stakeholder or any other hotlines that offer emotional support, as well as individuals in their own lives. We also want to highlight positive affirmations to help calm any trauma responses, to remind the individual that they are safe and not in danger or in harm's way, especially when they might be alone and might be experiencing a trigger in which they don't necessarily need crisis response services, but they need to ground themselves. Which brings us to grounding activities. By grounding the individual into sensory-based activities, it can really help them get in touch with what's going on in the body and in the mind, and really ground them in the present moment so that they can think through what they would like to happen next. And lastly, we should be thinking through with them some things to avoid that don't aid their emotional or physical well-being. And when these individuals who are in a trafficking situation, we know that they don't have a lot of autonomy or control over what they can bring into their lives. So it's really important to highlight the things that they can control and that they should be avoiding. And so this could be things like their unsafe zones that they have already identified in their home or in wherever their trafficking location is. So now we're going to move towards a practical case application of trauma-informed crisis response and safety planning. So I'm going to read a quick case example, and then we're going to talk through how best to approach this sort of situation. So in this example, we have an adult non-binary individual who's in an active sex trafficking situation, who is requesting transportation within a few hours to a local safe space within their community. They would like help getting to their community center before their partner gets home. The individual is concerned about continued physical and emotional harm, and they note that they have felt safe there and can access services and support from friends within the LGBTQ+ community. So continuing with this case example, we know that the trauma responses could be that the individual speaks too quickly for the stakeholder to understand the crisis. We know that this happens very often because folks who are in active crises can be very emotionally escalated because of the potential danger or because of the potential risks that they're taking and reaching out. The individual in the situation also hyperventilates and cries during the interaction. They're reaching out through cell phone, and the services that they are identifying that they need include transportation and trying to access culturally competent, emotionally supportive services. So I'm going to pause for a moment to allow for some answers here. How should this situation be approached, given that we have highlighted all of these crisis response tools and steps? That's great. Yes, engaging in some self-soothing techniques, encouraging the client to take a few deep breaths, and affirming that you guys will figure this out together. Absolutely. Acknowledging that they are not alone. What else can we do here? Absolutely. Thank you, Sandy. There is no safety plan here. So what can we do to safety plan? What are some things that we want to make sure are at the forefront of this crisis response? Yes, ask their pronouns. We know this individual is a non-binary adult, so we want to make sure that when we are engaging with them, we are asking for their pronouns, their chosen names, and identifying what safety means to them. I'm going to pause as these answers trickle in. Thank you, everyone who's participating. Caroline Ackerman says, plan what they need from home before leaving. Absolutely. We want to make sure, especially since they are exiting their situation, that they have access to medications, to chargers, to identification, all of those things. Terry says, are they safe now? Yeah. Are there any concerns with their current location? Is there anyone there monitoring them? And is there anyone that a potential advocate who's going to help them get from point A to point B should be concerned about? Thank you, John, for pointing out if they are using a cell phone, is their location services, are they on? Danielle says, allow them to have some control over the situation and ask them questions to determine what they believe would be good safety planning measures and how best we can help them. Absolutely. Is there anything else that we should be exploring when it comes to the location that they're going? Holly, thank you for pointing that out. Determining current safety and asking about the time restraint. Absolutely. Could the partner get home early? Does the abuser know where the community center is? And do they know if they have been there before? Right. Do we know where the abuser is? Right. That is absolutely fantastic. Ask about the community center. Is it secure? Yes. Will your continued needs be met? Will you have access to life-sustaining necessities there, especially if you're not planning to go back to your situation? Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Maya, for pointing that out. I hope I said your name right. Is law enforcement able to assist with leaving? And is law enforcement going to be required for leaving? Because we know that service providers are definitely not going to put themselves in an actively violent situation and potentially cause more harm than good. So we want to make sure that whatever safety parameters are discussed, that law enforcement is also discussed as a potential option, not as a requirement. Denise says, we need to know what type of facility they would feel safe in, going to a male or female or co-ed facility. Absolutely, this person is a non-binary individual. So we want to make sure that whatever services that they are looking for are easily accessible for their gender needs. And an alternative to that is if there are no gender-based or non-binary based services that are available outside of that community center, what can we do moving forward to make sure that they are continually comfortable accessing these services? Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on to the next slide. So in addressing this case example, we can do a couple of things that folks have already identified. From a trauma-informed and person-centered approach, one thing is just confirming gender pronouns and talking about how they would like to be looped into all of this planning. We could also do some de-escalation and grounding for that hyperventilation and crying, and just bring them back to the present moment by doing a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 senses activity. And that activity is just 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 that you smell, and so on. We also want to assess for that safety component, like many of you have already identified. What's the current physical safety and any pending risks? Are we just concerned about the partner, or is there anyone else who can come back? We want to determine time frame of any safety risks, like many of you have already pointed out. And then safe words for a quick exit. We know that this person has said that their partner is out right now, but what if they come back? What should we be doing? And what words are going to tell us that they're back and that the dynamics of safety have changed? And confirm contact permissions. They're reaching out via a cell phone. Is it their cell phone? Does anyone else have access to that cell phone? Is that cell phone in their name? All of those things to really understand what's at play here. And then determine appropriate transportation services. You want to think, do we as a stakeholder have the appropriate resources and services for this individual? Or do we need to loop in other stakeholders? And lastly, we need to safety plan, like a couple of you have identified. We want a safety plan for any gender confirming medications that they have said that they use, or any medications that, that are going to be life sustaining. Are there any safe zones or unsafe zones that we should be thinking about that might be limited to the home? Or are there any unsafe zones outside of the home, such as any areas that they need to be avoiding because they know that their partner knows people there, or they've had issues with safety in those places? And lastly, planning for that future emotional and bodily safety. So really thinking through what that emergency wellness plan looks like. So that brings us just to the end here. So I'm going to highlight one upcoming Project Trust event, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions until 2 p.m. Coming up in June, we have a trauma-informed engagement in legal settings webinar. We'll be joined with our partners at CAST, Martina Vandenberg, the president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. We'll be discussing methods to educate stakeholders on best practices in implementing trauma-informed engagement skills in tools in a legal setting. Please look out for that information when it goes out via SANAD, as well as when it is posted on the Project Trust website. And if you are interested in getting any sort of customized training and technical assistance support, you can reach out to Project Trust via the web address and email listed here. And now I'm going to pause and open it up to questions.
It looks like we have one question in the Q&A.
Gotcha. Okay, so Lourdes Muniz says, didn't quite catch that the buddy system code word on the first bullet on this page and what that means. So the buddy system code word is just like any other safe word setup, but this is just with someone that the individual has identified as being safe. So this could be an individual such as their friend or family member or neighbor, or anyone who has any sort of idea about the safety nuances for their particular situation. So they could set up a safe word to send to someone to say that they are safe today or unsafe. Are there any additional questions that I can answer right now? Okay, we have another question. How can we as a service provider engage in trauma response trauma-informed response when there is a lack of trust in the relationship with the client. Some clients are very distrustful of anyone who works with the government. That is a fantastic question. And the first thing that we should be doing in any engagement is talking about what they want. By putting their needs first and acknowledging that that you are there and to listen to them in the ways that feel good for them, and letting them know about all of your mandated requirements when it comes to reporting or looping in law enforcement for unsafe situations. By providing them with all that information up front, you can start to build a trusting relationship by just giving them the information and letting them know that you are there to support them in whatever way they want you to fulfill that role. You're very welcome. Any additional questions? Thank you, Kate, for reminding us of that. If anyone else has any questions, following this webinar, feel free to reach out to us to Project Trust for any additional tools. And so I'm going to go ahead and put the email right into the chat. There you go. And I'm going to stay on for just a couple more minutes to allow for any additional questions. I thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar. All of the resources and tools that we've discussed today will be linked on the Project Trust website. I will also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone with handouts that capture the most important parts of this presentation today. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your day.